working?
Good morning and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church in Tullahoma. Today is Sunday, February 4th, 2024. So we're going to open with a reading, and it is, the inherent worth and dignity is the first principle of UUA. Reverence and respect for human nature is at the core of the Unitarian Universalist faith. We believe that all the dimensions of our being carry the potential to do good. We celebrate the gifts of being human, our intelligence and our capacity for observation and reason, our senses and ability to appreciate beauty, our creativity, our feelings and emotions. We cherish our bodies as well as our souls. We can use our gifts to offer love, to work for justice, to heal injury, to create pleasure for ourselves and others. So now we will light the chalice. So if someone there will light the chalice, I will also light one here.
Today's chalice lighting is for lighting the chalice in honor of the Unitarian Universalist first principle. We believe to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person.
All right, we now move on to announcements. So are there announcements there at church? Carrie?
The flowers today came from UTSI. When I stepped out the door yesterday after the service, there they sat.
Oh.
So I wish we could have had them during the service, but that's okay. But I thought that was really nice of them to send that.
Thank you. Other announcements? Let's see, Chuck.
On Doug's behalf, I'll mention that Zen group will meet here on Wednesday at 6, followed by our Wednesday night discussion group that'll meet at 7:15 after Zen. So, and we're continuing to discuss the book Ethics in the Real World by Peter Singer. So come on out if you're so inclined. We try to finish by 9, and Annie usually brings some really good snacks. So. You can also attend on Zoom, but you won't get the snacks.
All right.
That's
Thank you, Chuck. Other announcements?
Gene?
Oh, Gene, yes, go ahead.
I'm going to introduce our visitor. This is Susan Moody from Silver City, New Mexico, who's been, she took me to surgery and she picked me up from surgery, and now she's been babysitting for a week.
Welcome.
And by the way, I'm glad to see everybody.
We're glad to
We're
see
glad
you.
to see you, Gene.
All right, welcome. So, other announcements? Tom, yes.
I'm going to do this. I'm working on a talk for next week, and I've debated with myself, is this really relevant or not? I think it is. And the subject matter has to do with our brains as a neural net and our perceived internal reality versus the external reality, which seems to be out there hard and solid. So there's two kind of aspects to what we perceive as reality, and I'm going to try to just raise some issues with that. I have got, for those of you who do not have neural net background or anything, I can send you an example of it. My son sent me one. I said, send me something to that. So I've got that, and I'll send it to you, or I can send it to everybody. It's a little game thing. It shows how it works. And anyway, thank you. Just a shameless plug.
All right. Thank you, Don. Appreciate you stepping up and speaking. That's what we need. All right, other announcements. All right, I'll make one announcement and then we'll go to a responsive reading. So this is our usual request for donations. So if you want to donate to the church, please just send a check to the UU Church of Tullahoma, P.O. Box 331, in Tullahoma 37388. There's also a little shaker box in the back if you want to put a contribution in there. Last call for announcements. All right, we're going to do our responsive reading, and it is number 550 in the book. So it is titled, We Belong to the Earth. And I'll give you a moment to come to that page.
I can balance you
I think
out.
everybody's there. So, all right.
That sounds like my house, too.
So we belong to the earth. Just so you know, the earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth.
This we know, all things are connected like the blood which unites one family.
All things are connected.
Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons and daughters of the earth.
We did not weave the web of life. We are merely a strand in it.
Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves.
Okay, all right. So now we'll move on to our speaker. So Chuck, the floor is now yours.
All right, and the podium.
Yeah, that too. More important. Yes.
Okay, good morning. Despite what is said on Facebook at one point, my talk today is on our second principle, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Not on the first principle. I did that one in December. So this is an encore presentation of a talk that I first gave in the year 3 BC, before COVID, which seems a lot longer ago than it actually was. I'm sure you'll agree. It was the second of a series of talks I did on each of our 7 UU principles. This one had a lot of references to then current events, and so it took quite a bit more updating than I thought it would. And in the process, I'll apologize, it got a little bit longer. I am fully aware that the Unitarian Universalist Association, the UUA, is on the verge of replacing the current version of our principles. A couple of things about that. One, the proposed replacement in the UUA bylaws won't become official until at least this year's UUA General Assembly in June. And two, as near as I can discern, the proposed replacement is not inconsistent with or incompatible with our current principles. Largely, it's a restatement in different form. And it might even give me an excuse to do a whole new series. In any event, for at least a little longer, the principles as we've come to know them and as they have stood since 1987 are still our principles. So today I'd like to start simply by going over those principles, which are listed in the front of your hymnal. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. I have found our principles, taken as a whole, to constitute a remarkably complete, self-consistent, and interlocking moral code. These principles were agreed upon by our association, not handed down as law by a prophet or a deity. Thus, they constitute a living tradition that we can add to or clarify or update as the need arises, as we are apparently on the verge of doing. As Unitarian Universalists, we don't have a creed, but we do have our principles, which are at the core of what it means to be a UU. And while there's plenty of room for interpretation of their meaning, according to our bylaws, a member of our congregation is expected to be in sympathy with these principles. The principles are not a belief system, rather they're a framework around which to build our individual belief systems, or a touchstone against which to test our beliefs. That is, if we find our beliefs to be in conflict with the principles, we need to take a close, hard look at those beliefs. For example, while we're each free to pursue our own search for truth and meaning, wherever that search leads us, to be authentic UUs, we need to reciprocate and to acknowledge that everyone else has that same freedom. I think of the second principle, that we affirm and promote justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, to be a natural consequence of the first. Having asserted the inherent worth and dignity of every person, it is incumbent on us to treat each other accordingly. The second principle, in other words, is how we put the first principle into practice. A couple of disclaimers. First, as I've said many times before, my only real qualification to speak to you is that I think about stuff a lot, often from unusual perspectives. I don't pretend to be an expert on the subjects I'm talking about. This is just one UU's viewpoint. I only hope to give you some things to ponder, to stimulate your own thinking, and maybe, just maybe, encourage you to act on that thinking. Second disclaimer, my own spiritual development has led me more and more down a Buddhist path, both in practice and in viewpoint. I don't consider this limiting in any way, quite the opposite, but I bring it up to let you know that I see the world more and more through a Buddhist lens. Part of that is that Zen meditation and mindfulness breeds an appreciation of what Thich Nhat Hanh called inner being, the understanding that we exist not as independent entities, but as part of that interdependent web of our seventh principle. That our lives are interconnected in very complex ways and are in large part shaped by the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And that realization breeds compassion toward others as surely as night follows day. Now, as I did with the first principle, I'm going to start by dissecting the wording. I think that with several of the principles, we tend to run the words together without fully digesting their individual meanings. I'll leave the in-human relations part alone as being fairly self-evident and focus on the justice, equity, and compassion part. Now, because it's easier, I'll start with the definition of equity. Just to be clear, the definition we're after is not the net monetary value of one's stake in a property or business. Now, we're after the more general and simpler definition, fairness or impartiality. A longer synonym is equitableness. An equitable system or society is one in which everybody is treated fairly without bias, prejudice, or discrimination. Justice is a bit harder to pin down. The dictionary definitions make justice sound like a synonym for equity, perhaps in more of a legalistic sense, but I think the way we use it is in the sense of corrective or restorative action. That is, justice is the correction of past injustice or of existing inequities. So I think of equity as the desired state of human affairs and justice as the action needed to get from here to there, or in some cases back to there. So in other words, from my point of view, the term restorative justice is redundant. The details of what constitutes equity or justice in a society and in its legal system are obviously going to be a matter of widely varying opinion, but there are some aspects we could probably all agree on. We'll get back to that. Compassion is a very similar word to empathy. Empathy is basically from a Greek root meaning to feel or suffer along with, while compassion is from a Latin root meaning essentially the same thing. But there's an important difference in the English definitions. Empathy is basically imagining oneself in another's place, or in the fuller dictionary.com definition, the psychological identification with or vicarious experiencing of the feelings, thoughts, or attitudes of another. Also from dictionary.com, compassion basically means empathy with someone, quote, stricken by misfortune, accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate the suffering, unquote. In other words, empathy can be relatively neutral, but compassion implies the urge to do something about it. So the way I think of how the concepts fit together is that compassion is what gives us the desire and the drive to see justice done, even when we are not the direct victims of the injustice, to establish or reestablish equity in human relations. When we talk about justice, we're often talking about either criminal justice or social justice. And while the main thrust of the second principle would seem to be social justice, there's a lot of overlap between the two, especially when we consider the injustices in our criminal justice system. The Ware lecture at the UUA General Assembly in 2017, which was the year I originally wrote this, was delivered by Bryan Stevenson, founder of the Equal Justice Initiative and author of the book Just Mercy. From the blurb on the back of the book, Bryan Stevenson was a gifted young attorney when he founded the Equal Justice Initiative, a legal practice dedicated to defending the poor, the wrongly condemned, and those trapped in the furthest reaches of our criminal justice system, unquote. It was an incredibly moving and inspiring talk. If you weren't there, I have some bad news and some good news. The bad news is that it wasn't recorded, so you missed it. The good news is that most of what he spoke about is included in the book, which is probably why the publisher didn't want the lecture recorded, which I have since read and highly recommend. I'd also recommend the 2019 biographical movie of the same name with Michael B. Jordan as Bryan Stevenson. We can also think of justice as divided into justice for individuals and collective justice for oppressed or marginalized groups. But it becomes apparent from reading Stevenson's book and from other accounts that collective justice is composed of individual experiences, that there is a human face to every injustice, that abstract principles have concrete consequences. Beyond recommending that you read Stevenson's book, I'm not going to say a lot about our criminal justice system, except as it relates to social justice in the broader sense. And where that ties in is in the unavoidable conclusion that our criminal justice system is seriously broken. As a society, we do have a need, a right, and an obligation to maintain order and to defend ourselves against crime. But for the bastion of freedom that is the United States of America, to have the fifth highest incarceration rate of any country in the world is simply ridiculous. And because somebody's going to ask, the ones who beat us out for the higher rates are El Salvador, Cuba, Rwanda, and Turkmenistan. You'll notice a lot of names that aren't on that list. That rate has more than quadrupled since 1972. There are many contributors to this, and again, I'm not going to go too far down this track, but to a large extent, it's a system that preys on poor and minorities. It's largely a consequence of the so-called school-to-prison pipeline, which, to use Wikipedia's summation, is the disproportionate tendency of minors and young adults from disadvantaged backgrounds to become incarcerated because of increasingly harsh school and municipal policies, unquote. And of course, in our society, once someone has been incarcerated, they find a lot of doors closed to them and their opportunities severely limited. Those practices may have their roots in the post-Reconstruction era practice of convict leasing, a form of de facto slavery that persisted for decades after the Civil War. Black men were imprisoned for minor or vaguely defined crimes, then legally leased out by the state to private industry. Up on the mountain, visiting Sewanee professor Dr. Camille Westmont recently did a lot of work, both literally and figuratively, digging into the history of the Lone Rock Stockade in Tracy City, which was a private prison for leased convicts who were forced to work in the coal mines and coke ovens there. She's featured in an episode of the podcast and radio show Reveal entitled Locked Up, the Prison Labor That Built Business Empires. If anyone's interested, I can share the link. The Southern Poverty Law Center, best known for tracking hate groups, also does a lot of good work identifying and going after those sorts of inequities. But as a society, we seem to have a notion that the best way to go after crime is to impose longer, harsher sentences and to over-criminalize minor offenses rather than to identify and address the root problems. Equity is a distinctly different concept than equality. Equality implies treating everyone the same regardless of their personal circumstances, which can be decidedly unfair. Equity, on the other hand, implies providing each individual with the tools that person needs to succeed, to realize their potential. One snarky quote to relate criminal justice to social inequity, the author Anatole France, sorry if I mispronounced his name, said in 1894, quote, "In its majestic equality, the law forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, beg in the streets, and steal loaves of bread." I'm going to introduce my discussion of equity in human relations by talking about sources of inequity. Inequity is largely rooted in prejudicial treatment on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, ethnicity, national origin, or any other classification we can come up with to divide people. Ultimately, these distinctions are just artificial groupings used to pit people against each other. I can't talk honestly about inequity in the United States, and this is where it's going to get a little long, without talking about racism. I'm limiting my discussion here to the United States. Other nations have their own unique issues and their own oppressed groups. As an older white male, this is frankly a bit outside my comfort zone, but we all need to step outside our comfort zones now and then. Because equity is not a one-size-fits-all concept, you can't address inequity without at least trying to see what the world looks like from another's point of view. And the lived experience of most Black Americans is decidedly different than the lived experience of most white Americans. I've come to realize that there are some terms whose academic meanings are different from their general usage, which is unfortunate because it leads to misunderstandings. Racism itself is one of those terms. Racism, in the academic sense, is the systematic oppression of a group of people based on their race, or at least the belief that such oppression is justifiable. It is not the same thing as racial bias or racial prejudice, although it is rooted in those and often used as a synonym for those. So there is technically no such thing as reverse racism in America. Is it possible for a Black American to hate white people? Of course it is. Does that lead to oppression of white people? Hardly. By the formal definition, only a group that holds the power to oppress can actually practice racism. We also tend to use the term racism to refer to similar attitudes toward and treatment of people based on religion, Muslims for example, national origin, immigration status, or other such divisions. I think that's because we don't have any handy alternative words for other categories of oppression, so we just use racism as sort of a catch-all term. And just by the way, here's a fun statistic if you harbor an assumption that Arab and Muslim are virtually synonymous. At most, 40% of American Muslims are Arabic, while over 60% of American Arabs are Christians. Beware of stereotypes. We've made progress toward dismantling racism, but we have a long, long way to go. Overt de jure racism, based on laws specifically aimed at denying Black Americans their rights, has largely been replaced by much more subtle and insidious de facto forms of oppression. We've moved from institutionalized de jure racism to a less obvious but very real de facto racism. Not that there isn't still plenty of blatant racial hatred out there. Those less obvious techniques often take the form of laws and systems aimed at poor people in poor neighborhoods. Obviously, not all Black Americans are poor, and not all poor Americans are Black. But poverty rates are higher among Blacks and other non-white groups than among whites. So policies aimed at poor people disproportionately affect people of color. This makes such covert racism a rather imprecise weapon, but the overall result is much the same. Such techniques include, for example, the aforementioned school-to-prison pipeline, in which juvenile misbehavior is criminalized in poor neighborhoods, resulting in young people being branded as criminals at an early age and put into a hole they can never climb out of. Voter suppression, disguised and defended as voter identification laws, purportedly to protect against a non-existent voter fraud problem. Making voting more difficult in urban areas by providing too few polling places and other techniques. And predatory lending practices, in some cases backed up by the court system. Again, the SPLC does excellent work exposing and fighting some of these things. Some of this covert racism is promulgated and perpetuated by so-called big data techniques. I'm going to recommend another book that's a little on the scary side called Weapons of Math Destruction, How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy by Cathy O'Neill. You can't legally deny people services or charge more for insurance or deny an inmate parole based on their race, of course. But if a computer does it based on their zip code because they live in a high crime area, that's different. If a computer algorithm does it to you, that's science, not racism, right? O'Neill warned that those algorithms are generally not transparent. The public has no way of knowing what's under the hood. Since her book was published, artificial intelligence technology has progressed by leaps and bounds, and the situation is undoubtedly worsening by the day. The algorithms update themselves and are even less comprehensible by humans than before. I was recently reminded that one of the many fields in which humans may be largely supplanted is legal research and writing. Legal research performed without human oversight is a frightening notion. Now, just to take myself even further out of my comfort zone before I move on, I'm going to talk about another term that means different things to different people. White privilege. This is just my take on it. Many, probably most, white Americans will get quite defensive if you use that phrase. What they think you're accusing them of is belonging to some private club where everything is handed to them on a silver platter, and that's something you need to give up. Oh, you're white? Here's your cushy job, your house in the suburbs, and the keys to your nice new car. The gut reaction is to say, wait a minute, privilege? I've had a successful life, but I worked my tail off to get it. I clawed my way up the ladder. Nobody handed me anything. But that's not what white privilege means. For most white Americans, especially heterosexual white American males, our privilege that we're not even aware of is that as we clawed our way up the ladder, while there might or might not have been a lot of hands reaching down to help us up, at least nobody was stepping on our fingers or sawing through the rungs before we could reach them. No matter how difficult it was, at least we had a ladder to climb. So from my point of view, white privilege, the privilege to be allowed to climb the ladder without being stepped on, isn't something that needs to be taken away from whites, but something that needs to be the norm for everybody. And as whites, our privilege isn't readily apparent to us because it's the water we swim in. It's always been there, and we take it for granted. One aspect of white privilege is that if we want to pretend racism isn't a thing, we white folks can pretty much get away with just not thinking about it. That's a state I'm actively trying to avoid. At the same General Assembly where Brian Stevenson spoke, I attended a lecture by Dr. Robin DiAngelo entitled, "What Does It Mean to Be White?" So impressed was I with her direct but gentler than I expected approach to the subject of white racial literacy that I bought her book of the same title, and later led a discussion group of that book. I know many white people who claim that they don't see color or don't see race, by which they mean that they treat everyone the same regardless of skin color. And there's nothing wrong with that in and of itself. It's a good starting point. To do one's best to rid oneself of one's own racial biases and prejudices is admirable. But stay with me here. I've come to see that being able to not see color is actually an aspect of white privilege. In most cases, whites encounter black people as individuals in predominantly white spaces, and it's easy to treat them as individuals. If you're white, imagine suddenly finding yourself in a place where you're the only white face around. And while most of the black people around you seem okay with you being there, you're getting a few looks that you interpret as, what are you doing here? Or even, you're not really welcome here. Now, do you maybe see color? What you're experiencing is what most black people feel in the white spaces in which they're obliged to coexist all the time. They don't have the luxury of not seeing color. It's probably not possible to have attended recent UU General Assemblies without having one's consciousness raised at least a little bit, and I've been making an effort over the past several years to continue that process, in part by reading books by people I saw or learned about at General Assemblies. In honor of Black History Month, which just started a few days ago, I'm going to give you a recommended reading list, in addition to Just Mercy and What Does It Mean to Be White. But I'm going to take a drink of coffee first. The first book I'll add to the list is The 1619 Project, which provides a historical narrative consisting of a series of essays that started as magazine articles, I believe, interspersed with poetry and photographs. This was a controversial book that provoked a backlash because the notion that teaching detailed racial history might make white students feel guilty or uncomfortable led to some reactionary laws and removal of books discussing race from school libraries. I don't know about you, but trying to keep me from reading a book is a sure way to pique my interest. Learning history isn't necessarily comfortable. Sometimes if you have a wound, you have to rip the scab off to keep it from festering, if you want it to heal. The purpose of an honest account of the history of blacks in America isn't to make whites feel guilty. If it does make you feel guilty, perhaps you should take a close look at why that is. What I took away from the book is a deeper understanding of what American history looks like from a black perspective. More suggested reading, What Does It Mean to Be White? A follow-on book by Robin DiAngelo. Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's perhaps a hard read for white people, but it's an eye-opening look at one man's perspective of what it's like to be black in America. How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. I admittedly haven't finished that book yet, but I had the privilege of hearing Dr. Kendi at the 2022 General Assembly in Portland, Oregon. He was the Ware lecturer, but they did it differently in the form of a conversation between him and then UUA President Susan Frederick Gregg. Waking Up White, Finding Myself in the Story of Race by Debbie Irving. Racism Without Racists by Eduardo Bonilla Silva, which comes highly recommended, but which I admittedly have barely started. The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together by Heather McGee, which also comes highly recommended, but which hasn't gravitated to the top of my reading pile yet. And a little fiction based enough in reality to give a visceral account of what slavery was like. First, go way back to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which I am planning to read, and Dread, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp, which I have read. And finally, Ta-Nehisi Coates' novel, The Water Dancer, which combines a magical element with gripping realism in a tale of slaves attempting to escape to the north. What all this is about for white folks is just to try to get some insight into what the world looks like from black perspectives and thus gain some empathy. What you got to lose? If you haven't read some of those books or any of those books, pick one up. It's Black History. Having gone on at some length about inequity, I'm going to describe what I think equity in human relations looks like. To me, it means that everybody gets a level playing field, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, national origin, or any of the other categories used to divide us. I have this utopian view that a culture that allows all its members to flourish as individuals, that affords everybody the opportunity to pursue their dreams and develop their individual potential, will in turn flourish as a culture. I think that this begins with guaranteeing every single child a healthy start in life and the opportunity for a good education. A strong public education system is absolutely essential. I believe my views are broadly consistent with humanist principles. I realize that in the real world, children born to wealthy parents are going to have advantages that those born in poverty aren't, and acknowledge that white children are more likely to be born to wealthy parents than black children. But as long as those born in poverty at least have some realistic hope of escaping that poverty, as long as upward mobility is a real possibility, we do have a shot at an equitable society. The trouble is that increasing economic inequality is threatening that upward mobility, and because of the intersectionality of race and class resulting from many, many years of institutionalized racism and resulting historical consequences, that threat disproportionately affects communities of color. Covertly racist policies make it difficult to overcome one's own past mistakes or to overcome the disadvantages of one's environment. When even the possibility of upward mobility is taken away, the result is hopelessness and despair, the opposite of my rosy vision of an equitable society. My ideal vision is based on equality of opportunity, insofar as possible, not necessarily equality of outcomes, although I do think that anybody who works a full-time job and does it well should be paid a living wage. A little competition in life isn't a bad thing, as long as it's fair and based on merit, not on race, gender, or other extraneous factors. But if you think that we're there already, that this is a country of equal opportunity for all, you really aren't paying attention. Are there differences in human potential related to race? It'd be hard to prove one way or the other, but there is a lot of evidence to the contrary. The strongly supported thesis of the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Fates of Human Societies by Jared Diamond is that historical differences in technological and social development between different human populations are entirely due to various accidents of geography and have nothing to do with racial differences per se. Correlation, I don't think I said it before, doesn't prove causality. It's another fascinating read, by the way. I did a talk on that book once that I may have to revisit. What about gender? Obviously, there are biological differences between men and women. Does that affect suitability for certain career paths? As with race, we choose to assert not, but we could be wrong. Perhaps there are certain jobs that on average are better suited to women than men, or vice versa. But even if that were true, every individual deserves the opportunity to prove themselves at whatever they set their mind to. The trouble with believing that there are racial or gender limitations is that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. A belief that a certain job can only be done by men, for example, results in women not being considered, which leads to only men doing it, which reinforces the belief. Don't fall into the trap of assuming that correlation proves causation. Give everybody the opportunity they deserve and let the results fall where they may. Now I'm going to talk a little about compassion. When I learn of someone who has had a worse lot in life than I have, and I'm tempted to think that they somehow brought it on themselves, I sometimes have to remind myself that there, but for a simple twist of fate, go I. No matter how hard we work or how carefully we plan, we're all just one unforeseeable event from disaster. It's obvious that someone who suffers an unexpected tragedy or is beset by a serious health problem beyond their control does not deserve our judgment, but rather our compassion. We can fully grasp that what happened to them could just as easily have happened to us. The beginning of a deeper compassion lies in recognizing that even people we feel justified in condemning may be at the mercy of forces beyond their control, and that were we in their situation, we might have turned out the same way. Criminals, terrorists, others we consider inherently evil may just be products of their environment, who may not have had the opportunities or options that you or I did, or the positive influences in their lives. It is, of course, necessary to defend ourselves against the harm that they cause, but at the same time, we need to consider what went wrong in the world to bring us to that point and how we might go about fixing it. The Buddhist call for compassion is rooted in the teaching of interbeing, that we are all deeply interconnected. Thich Nhat Hanh, in Peace is Every Step, relates a story about a 12-year-old refugee girl on a small boat who was raped by a pirate and then jumped into the sea and drowned herself. His rather incredible insight into that tragedy, which inspired him to write a very moving poem, was that the pirate was a product of his environment, that born into the same circumstances, he, Thich Nhat Hanh that is, might have turned out the same way, and that we all bear some collective responsibility for allowing those conditions to continue in a broken world. That's perhaps more compassion than I am capable of, so I'll have to settle for aspiring to it. But I do believe that justice should be about restoring or establishing equity, not about vengeance or retaliation. And that justice without mercy is best summed up by a quote attributed to Gandhi, "An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind." Another call for mercy comes from Brian Stevenson, who reminds us that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. One way to cultivate compassion within yourself is through loving kindness or meditation, a practice which is Buddhist, although not Zen in origin. I'm just mentioning this in passing. If you're interested, ask me about it sometime. Again, compassion involves not only concern for the suffering of others, but a desire to do something about it. Unitarians and Universalists in America have a long, proud history of involvement in social justice work, often in the forefront, and with an impact far out of proportion to our numbers. It's a tradition we need to continue. At the national level, the UUA has been endeavoring to do exactly that. The UUA has had a tumultuous few years, which I've had the privilege of seeing up close as a General Assembly attendee and occasional delegate.
Chuck, I think Gene needs to move around, his legs stiffening up on him. So.
Oh.
Do you want to get up and walk?
Got to.
You can. Anyway, I'm getting close.
We're pro movement. It's okay.
Yeah. Anyway, I think the UUA has found its footing for a renewed focus on social justice in several areas. How we got there was a bit messy, but I think we're ending up in the right place. Transformation often is messy. I have a few suggestions about working for justice that I'd like to share. Again, I'm claiming no expertise, but perhaps you'll find a helpful insight or two. First, I've asked this before, but it bears repeating. Please don't act out of rage. There's nothing wrong with feeling angered by injustice. Anger is a natural human emotion. But please learn to deal with your anger constructively and not let it control you. Process your anger, then act with a clear head and a firm resolve. To fight for peace is a paradoxical notion. To respond to hate with hate or violence with violence simply perpetuates hate and violence. Please look to this historical example of leaders like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., or more recently Reverend William Barber, for inspiration. Even if the difference seems only semantic, don't fight for peace and justice, work for it. To quote Dr. King, hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Dr. King, by the way, was paraphrasing an ancient Buddhist text, the Dhammapada, which in the translation I have reads, "Animosity does not eradicate animosity. Only by loving kindness is animosity dissolved." I could summarize the message of the book, Peace is Every Step, by Thich Nhat Hanh as simply, to bring about peace in the world, we must first bring about peace in ourselves. And once we do that, the rest will take care of itself. A few more specific suggestions. A lot of social justice causes overlap. If you're part of a group focused on one issue that is dearest to your heart, but are aware of other groups involved with other issues that you are sympathetic to, you and they need to support each other and work together whenever possible. There's strength in numbers. Back each other up. Don't let those opposed to your cause drive wedges between you and those who should be your allies. This is the 21st century, and Google is your friend. usually. You don't need to take things at face value. Beware of anecdotal appeals to emotion. Anecdotes are no substitute for real statistics from credible sources. If you hear something that sounds unlikely, especially on social media, check it out. Even if you want it to be true, be skeptical. Do your own research. Being colorblind, as in I treat everybody the same and don't see race, is not enough to combat racism because it does nothing to level the playing field, to undo the social and economic damage of many years of inequity, but it is a start. If we woke up tomorrow in a world where racial bias had magically disappeared, repairing the damage that is the legacy of hundreds of years of racism would still be a generational task. But if you can't fix the problem, at least try not to make it worse. Although I'm learning that even that may require a bit of consciousness raising. If the task of fixing all the world's problems seems a little too overwhelming, try to find a way to make a difference in the lives of one or a few individuals who could use your help. And if, like me, you're still looking for the right opportunity to do that, in the meantime, find a way to support others in that work. If you're not in a position to be on the front lines, do what you can to support those who are, financially or in any other way you're able. Conclusion, finally. Again, our second principle is the practical result of the first. Having asserted that everybody has inherent worth and dignity, it is incumbent upon us to treat them fairly and compassionately. Life isn't fair and probably never will be completely fair, but the task before us is to endeavor to make it fairer than it is now. If we aspire to achieve justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, we certainly have our work cut out for us. It's especially disheartening when we seem to have to fight the same battles over and over again, but let's do it anyway. To quote Dr. King again, who was, by the way, paraphrasing 19th century Unitarian minister Theodore Parker, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And one more bit of inspiration from Wayne Arneson. This is number 698, your hymnal, if it sounds familiar. Take courage, friends. The way is often hard, the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone. So as always, try to help each other through this thing called life and strive to leave the world a little better than you found it. And thanks for listening.